Hey, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to cover controller input, and we'll discuss exactly what that means. We'd like to be able to move the mouse and, as a result, allow the character to look around and change its orientation in the world. Now, to do this, we're going to be changing properties on the controller. So let's talk about the controller. When we start the game, we have a character, and since we set that character's variable called AutoPossessPlayer equal to player0, the engine spawns a controller which then possesses the character. Controllers are designed to handle user input behind the scenes and take that data and move or change the character in some way. So a controller's purpose is to possess a pawn and control it using that user input. In a game, the controller represents a player. And a controller doesn't have a location per se, but it does have its own rotation. This means we can change the rotation of the controller and configure the character to follow that rotation. Now, we saw that Unreal Engine has a vector data type, which has X, Y, and Z components. Unreal Engine also has a rotator data type, which is similar to the vector, only instead of X, Y, and Z, it has a yaw, pitch, and roll. So let's see what those quantities mean. So here's our project. I'm going to open FPS Character and click on the viewport so I can see the character's mesh. And I'm going to select the character mesh. And up here, we see that snapping is enabled for rotation mode. And if I click on the little angle icon, snapping is now disabled. And I can enter rotation mode with the E key or this icon and access the rotation gizmo to rotate the character around. Now, when I select the blue arc, I'm rotating the mesh about the Z axis. When I do this, I'm changing the mesh's yaw. So yaw is the rotational value about the Z axis. If I instead select the green gizmo handle, I'm now rotating the mesh so that it's looking up or looking down. This is changing the pitch of the mesh component. Now, when I select the red handle, I'm tilting the mesh left and right, and this is changing the roll. So yaw, pitch, and roll are rotational quantities about their corresponding axes. Yaw rotates around the z-axis, pitch rotates around the y-axis, and roll rotates around the x-axis. So when we move the mouse, we'd like to be able to look up and down as well as left and right. To look left and right, we're going to want to change the character's yaw. And to look up and down, we'd like to change the character's pitch. Let's start with looking left and right. We're going to need an axis mapping. So let's go to Edit and Project Settings and scroll down to Input, and we'll be adding a new axis mapping. So I'm going to click plus next to Axis Mappings and create a new axis mapping called Turn. Now I'm going to click the drop-down under Turn, and under the Mouse category, we see Mouse X and Mouse Y. I'm going to choose Mouse X. Selecting Mouse X results in collecting data whenever we're moving the mouse left and right. So let's go back into FPS Character and click on Event Graph. Now here we have our move forward and move right. Just below that, I'm going to right-click and type Turn. And I see under Axis Events, Turn. This event was created as soon as I made the Turn axis mapping. And we have this axis value. Now just to show you this axis value when we move the mouse, I'm going to click off of the execution pin and use a print string node. And I'm going to take the axis value and plug it directly in to the print string. Now I'm going to compile and hit play. And now clicking in the viewport, if I move the mouse to the left, I get a negative value. And if I move the mouse to the right, I get a positive value. And if I move the mouse really quickly, that value increases. So the value represents a delta or change from the last frame to the current frame, representing how fast we're moving the mouse left and right. Now, I'd like to use this axis value to rotate the character. But instead of rotating the character directly, I'm going to add a rotation input to the controller. So let's click off of the execution pin, and we're going to use a node called Add Controller Yaw Input. Add Controller Yaw Input takes a float value. We're going to plug axis value directly in. Now this will rotate our controller, and we want our character to follow along with the controller. Now if we go up to the Components panel and click on FPS Character Self, we can search in the Details panel for a variable called Use Controller Rotation Yaw. We see that there are 3 variables like this. We see Use Controller Rotation Pitch, Use Controller Rotation Yaw, and use controller rotation roll. Now, use controller rotation yaw is checked by default. This means that as the controller rotation changes, the character will rotate along with it. So let's see how this works. I'm going to hit play. And now, clicking in the viewport, I can move the mouse left and right, and as we rotate the controller, the character follows along with the controller. This is perfect. So we're rotating the character left and right. In other words, we're changing its yaw, but we'd also like to change its pitch as well. So this will be your challenge. Add another axis mapping and call it look up, and link the mouse Y axis to this mapping. Then, in the character blueprint, use an add controller pitch input node and plug in that axis value. Go ahead and playtest this in the Pi, and then decide whether the scale for the axis mapping should be 1 or -1. Now we saw that use controller rotation yaw was checked by default for the character, but use controller rotation pitch was not. Make sure you check that so that our character will follow along with the controller when the controller's pitch changes. Pause the video and give this a try. Okay, so we're ready to add another axis mapping. I still have project settings open here. I'm going to add another axis mapping by clicking the plus icon, and I'm going to call this look up. And selecting the dropdown and expanding the mouse section, I'm going to choose mouse Y. Now I'm going to leave the scale value at 1 for now and see how this works. Let's click FPS character and right click, and I'm going to type look up. And here's the lookup axis event. Now dragging off of the execution pin, I'm going to type add controller pitch input and select that. And now I can plug axis value directly in to this node. Now we're adding pitch input to the controller, but we need to make sure our character follows along. So I'm going to click FPS character self and select use controller rotation pitch. I'm going to make sure that's checked. Now let's compile and hit play. And I'm going to click in the viewport and move the mouse up. And I notice that the character is looking down when I move the mouse up. And when I move the mouse down, the character looks up. This configuration is known as inverted in video games, and it's usually a setting that the player can change. I personally prefer for the character to look up when I move the mouse up. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to project settings and take our lookup axis mapping and change the mouse Y scale value to -1. Now when I go back and press play and click in the viewport, when I move the mouse up, I look up, and when I move the mouse down, I look down. And now we can look around. So we now have keyboard input to move the character, as well as mouse input to look around and change the character's rotation. Great job. So in summary, we added controller input by adding turn and lookup axis mappings and linking the mouse X and mouse Y to those axis mappings. We rotated the controller using add controller pitch and yaw input, and we made sure that the character follows along with the controller rotation by setting the use controller rotation pitch and yaw variables both to true. And now we're looking around with our mouse. Excellent. We now have the basics of movement. We'll continue developing this character in the next lecture. I'll see you soon.